As an avid romance reader, I've long wondered why we call women's fantasy and romance porn, whereas we do not say the same thing about Game of Thrones or Lord of the Rings. Today's episode, we're going to be talking about why female driven fantasy is often dismissed, while male centric fantasy is seen as classic. You're listening to Fed Up and Figuring It Out, unpacking politics, culture, and global power. If you ever thought, why does this all feel like bullshit? You're in the right place. I'm your host, Priya Mignot. As always, everything cited throughout this episode will be in this episode's description. Start off, we're going to be talking about childhood fantasy and the predominant male narrative. Growing up, the stories we're raised on are predominantly male. Regardless of sex, typically you follow a male protagonist through a certain journey of some sort. You can think of Harry Potter for this, or Percy Jackson. The stories that we are often read across gender are male protagonists. There's not often a series if you can think of one, that's amazing. But for me, when I come to think of like childhood stories and childhood chapter books, there isn't a series that is read widely by both men and women that has a woman protagonist. And Harry Potter and Percy Jackson are all told through the male perspective, which is not to say that they're not important books, that they're not lovely books to read, but it's an interesting fact or an interesting perspective when you look at things to be like, okay, we're not actually raised with many women protagonists across gender. The fantasy books boys and girls read at night aren't the narratives of boys. And that's not to say you shouldn't love these series. They are amazing like stories in so many ways. And I mean, there's a lot of controversy around some of the authors now. But they are really amazing stories and they take you really in depth into the world of fantasy and they are beautifully written. And that's not to say we should dismiss them just because they're written from a male perspective. Like right now, I'm actually rereading Percy Jackson, which is in here. I own Gryffindor merch. Like, I really do love these stories. But these are the stories that people often start with and so often end with. People often don't read past childhood. And so if they're only ever raised reading male narratives or anything like that and they just stop, they don't ever have to get to see a woman protagonist in their books. In primary school, when I was in high school, pretty much all of my English books were written by men or followed male protagonists. I remember in grade 12, I had to read the book All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. And we were supposed to be, I didn't love the book personally. I didn't really find joy in it, but it was considered a classic. And the problem for me was that there was little female character representation, and like the masculinity portrayal throughout the book was very like rigid, as we've talked about in previous episodes. And we were supposed to interpret it as a love story. And in my brain, I'm like, we don't know anything about the female characters in this book. So how can it be a love story? And like it was just such a one-sided, very obviously male gaze love story. And I didn't really love it for that reason. So, but it was considered a classic, despite having, again, it was taught in high school, but it had sex scenes in it, and it had romance in it, but it wasn't called smut. And it was, again, seen as this iconic book about Western love stories. Or it was not even a love story per se. Like it's not advertised as a love story. It's advertised as an adventure story, coming of age story. In high school, I also read Othello, which also again focused on the male protagonist throughout the series. In both the Othello and Cormac McCarthy book, my English teacher, who I really did like, he often was like, well, maybe the females are the villains of this book. And I'm like, how can the females of this book series, the women in this book series, be the villains when it's clearly the villains are other people? Clearly. And we don't know anything about the women in this series because there's no space for them. They can't be the catalyst for these villainous acts. I was just like, first off, we don't read any female authors. We don't read anything from the female protagonist lens. And now we're being taught and told that maybe if we consider from a different lens, the women are the bad people in this book. And I'm like, how is that even possible? Like, how is that even going through your head when we know nothing about them? And so I did bring up a complaint with that. So I was like, we didn't read a single book by a woman author in high school. The one book I did read that was by a woman author in high school that followed a woman protagonist was Pride and Prejudice. It was the only one I read throughout all of high school, but it was an optional reading between that or The Great Gatsby. So only half my class actually read Pride and Prejudice. Again, it's really interesting the way that we frame books. Like The Great Gatsby is considered a classic, and Pride and Prejudice is considered a classic as well. But Pride and Prejudice often is seen as like a woman's book, a romance book. It's a women's literature kind of thing. And The Great Gatsby isn't. It's seen as like, oh, anyone can read it because it's written by a male author through the male lens. And it's like, yeah, but they're both love stories. Like they both talk about love. That is the whole premise of both those books. And yet we treat them differently. Like one is for a very half the population to read, and one's for the entire population to read. And like, it doesn't make any sense. If people decide to read past like primary school level or past like their childhood, which I do encourage people to do, they often continue into fantasy series like Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I've never read Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, and from what I know, they probably wouldn't be my thing. I know there's not a lot of women in Lord of the Rings, and there's not a lot of women speaking in Lord of the Rings, or have like it does not pass the Bechdel test even remotely in the book, I don't think. And there is so much sexual violence and nudity in Game of Thrones that I absolutely know I would not be able to like it. However, the world building I respect immensely, and I'm not shitting on people who like these series, but expanding beyond them is important. Going beyond reading from the male lens or from male authors is extremely important. There are two kind of key problems that come up when we talk about this, though. First, there's a massive gap in reading between genders as people get older. Men are reading less and less, which is quite fascinating. Secondly, if they do continue, often they don't stray from male narratives and they dismiss women's stories and even sometimes women authors. For example, like, again, a lot of men are not reading, which is very interesting. Roughly 1 in 4 men read a novel or short story in 2022, compared to fewer than half of all women. And this is like a real big problem in some ways because as Instagram user at Luke Bateman points out, books teach empathy, kindness, and critical thinking skills. Like books are a way for like an emotional practice ground for people to come up with solutions. They actually develop the brain in a different way, reading. It fosters greater empathy, greater thinking skills, all these things because when you're reading, your brain can't really tell the difference between reality and fiction. And so it's why people get really attached to characters, it's why people get really attached to different series. But when you're reading, you're problem solving with the characters at the same time. And you are going through very unique experiences while reading. Reading also allows people to better articulate their emotions. And again, like as I think book talk has become really big, and I know there's men on book talk and I know there's women on book talk, but it's predominantly a woman's sphere. I always am a little bit concerned by it because men not reading is concerning. People not reading in general is concerning in some ways because it is such an important skill set for humans and such an important way to better understand the world, to not get sucked into propaganda, to have empathy for other people. It is such a fundamental skill. But if people even bother to read past high school, they, especially men, will dismiss women's stories and authors. And it's like that's a woman's thing. Women don't do the same thing to men. It is weird to me though that sometimes when a gender, like whole gender, is like that series or that author isn't for me because of their gender. And it's like men should read romance stories too. Men should read women's books as well, just like women read men's books. So why is it that when women write fantasy, do their stories get shoved into the women's porn box instead of the fantasy shelf? Men's fantasy series are often seen as serious world building. They are often seen as these articulate, amazing, immense worlds. And in many ways they are. In many ways they are. But when women's fantasy is written, it's seen as a guilty pleasure. It's seen as something to almost look down upon in some ways. Obviously, I don't. It's important to read both genders, but for women specifically, women's fantasies are stories where we get to run the show. We get to hear ourselves in the main characters. There are things missing from male fantasy stories that women just can't connect to because it's not realistic to how women live. And I'm sure it's vice versa. If men read a lot of women's books, they'd probably be like, okay, there's some things missing. This is not how men actually act. And it's like, that's fair, but at the same time, you have to read both. If you're, and like a few of my favorite series to this day, but with fantasy and romance, are Throne of Glass, which is right there. Throne of Glass is literally my favorite book series of all time. I started reading it when I was 12 years old. It's an 8 book series, and it's considered YA fantasy. However, later in the book, there is like some sex scenes. But the book series follows a main protagonist named Selena Sardathian, and throughout the whole 8 books, we follow her perspective. But it does alternate. Like there is in the first book, I think, if not in the first 2 books, there's 3 different main characters. There's Kale, there's Dorian, and there's Selena. And so we alternate between 2 male characters and a woman's character's perspective. And I think that's super interesting because throughout the whole rest of the series, every time there's new characters introduced, we alternate between female and male perspectives. And yes, the book series is written by a woman, so it is a little bit probably skewed from the male perspective, but it is still a really amazing story to read. And I think what is so impactful for many people reading women's written fantasy is that it focuses a lot on female agency. Often I find in male fantasy, women are seen as this altruistic, almost like can do no wrong pedestaled woman, or they're seen as a voiceless love interest, or they're seen as this witch who corrupts men. And it's like that's all you can be. And and you don't really get a voice in anyone's say. But in Throne of Glass at least, Selena is an assassin, so she is morally gray in many cases. And you follow like female rage. And I think that is such a unique thing too. And in the male's perspectives, we also get like rage and love and all the feelings they have. But it's so nice to see that like not a single character in this book series is made into a voiceless love interest. Like we get everyone's perspectives in so many ways. The book series, Throne to Glass, also relies heavily on friendships for both male and female. It talks about the relational bonds. I love that it shows that every character has the capabilities and shows a variety of the spectrum of emotions. And really uniquely in Throne of Glass as well, it also briefly talks about menstruation. And in Sarah J. Maas's other series, ACOTAR, it does talk about pregnancy, which I feel like a lot of fantasy books just completely gloss over despite that affecting 50% of the population. When we talk about romance in book series, I often find that, for example, with Cormac McCarthy's All the Pretty Horses, that's not classified as a romance. It's classified as a coming of age, it's classified as an adventure. And yet, in pretty much every male written adventure story with a male protagonist or a male narrative or whatever it is, there's romance in it. Absolutely, there's romance in it. They get the girl at the end, right? That's the idea. And so they are romances in some ways, but we don't call them romances, which I think is really interesting because like sometimes they actively go in search of romance and go in search of love, and yet we don't call them that. We call them classics instead of romance. And it almost feels like romance gets shoved into this box where it's women's only, and it's almost looked down upon in a way. But romance as a genre has had a profound impact on female participation and activity. Women have been reading romance since they started coming out, and it was one of the few ways women saw themselves in literature without being a voiceless character. They got to see their desires play out, which is very impactful and very profound in many ways. Again, because less men are reading, there are more women readers and writers taking up space to a degree. And this is like more of a recent thing to have more female authors and more female readers. Like you can look at the book talk community for this. It's run by women pretty much. There's book clubs in pretty much every part of the world at this point, run by women. And there's men's book clubs as well, but it's like a predominantly women's space. There's like all of us talk about Fable and Goodreads. Like all my girlfriends and I have Fable and Goodreads, and we talk about what books we're reading and all this kind of stuff. And for the longest time, women authors were dismissed or minimized, and now that's becoming less and less the case, especially by women. They're not being dismissed by women as much. The one thing that drives me a little bit nuts is that there is this assumption that if a woman writes fantasy, it must be about love or sex. But maybe we just like badass action stories where we matter. And let's be honest, when men write fantasies, they also write about love and sex but it's not dismissed in the same way women's writing is. And we've made a lot of progress in the last decade or so, in the last 3 decades, who knows? We've made a lot of progress in like having more authors and characters of color, more queer identities, more complex women. But there's still a long way to go in the valuing of both literature for men and women. Like, why didn't I read a single book by a woman in all of high school, except for Pride and Prejudice, which was optional? It's just this weird thing where we don't teach boys, especially, to read books by women with women protagonists. And yet we expect women and girls to read books with male protagonists and male narratives and male authors. And I think it's important that we do that, but it's just weird that we don't do the opposite way. I wanted to talk about a little bit about the women's porn myth in books. My problem isn't when it's said as a joke, because we also play into that quite a bit. We have the hashtag spicy book talk section and chapters and Barnes and Noble and all that kind of stuff. And like I even own a bookmark that says I like my books with a little bit of spice. My problem is when other people take it seriously and think that that is all women's literature is painted to be. So much of women's literature has nothing to do with sex and love and romance. So much of it does not. I mean, we play into it. We're like, yep, this is a smut book, whatever. But at the same time, I'm like, there's so many romances by men that we just don't call romances, and they're smut books. Like, Game of Thrones, that's probably smut. If you want to be actually critical of it, it's probably smut. It has the same levels as women's romance. And so that is what drives me nuts, is that when we take it seriously, when it's like women aren't reading anything of substance because they're reading fantasy and romance, it's like that's actually not true. We just have a different value scale for female and male written pieces in our society for some reason. And here's the thing. People love to call romance novels porn. But let's compare what's actually going on here. Porn is largely made by men for men. There's little to no plot, no emotional connection, and often very degrading to women. It shows them as these passive objects for pleasure, and that is all they are. It rarely features consent or mutual respect. We have no idea what the dynamic is between the two people having sex. Pornography is often just very explicit with no emotional or thematic buildup to it. In that fact, it alters the reward pathways in the brain, which focus on instant dopamine. And it obviously has had a huge impact on our society and the way we have relationships between men and women. Pornography is truly not good for relationships because of the way it narrow-mindedly creates instant dopamine without emotional connection, without showing what romance actually is. It just shows sex, which is really weird. Romance and fantasy novels are not the same thing as pornography. Often they are written by women for women. There's emotional buildup, there's mutual desire, there's complex characters. You get to see them work through problems, you get to see the dynamics at play. It's not just instant gratification. You have to again, you're with the characters, you're working through the situation, you get to feel the things they're feeling. And that is very different than pornography. The real thing women get off on in these books is security, kindness, love, and respect. And if people think that's laughable or just should be categorized as smut, then maybe look in the mirror, because those are very important aspects in a relationship. And often the books we call smut have like, I don't know, 30, maximum 30 pages. It's a big book, like Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas. Maybe there's 25 to 30 pages of sex. That is a 500-page book. I don't know why people are so quick to assume women's literature is smut when so much of it is not even remotely. They're not even having sex in the book half the time. The vast majority of the time, it's like 5% of the book, and you're like, even romance books, like all of Ali Hazelwood's books, they're really good and they do actually have a lot of sex in them, but at the same time, comparatively to the page count of that book, there's not a lot of sex in it. So it's I think it's a weird thing where like pornography is an instant, like however long video, but it's an instant gratification. You're watching it. There's no other storyline to it. And with romance books and fantasy books, there's storylines to it. There's important things happening. There's character development in it. And yes, there's sex, but that's kind of normal for humans and for other creatures. But like It is just that really interesting fact that it's like it's not the same thing. Like it's not the same thing. Here's the thing. I read a lot in 2025 and I'm reading a lot in 2026 too. But a couple of my stats in 2025. I read 30 books in 2025 about, and that's not including like books for school, but 2025 was a pretty romance heavy year for me. I read a lot of romance books. I read like 10 pure romance books with nothing else. Like they weren't fantasy books, they were just straight romance. And sure, a lot of them had smut, but they also had connection, and that's more important. That is often also why I gravitate more towards YA books because I actually don't really enjoy the smut as much. I enjoy the tension and the emotional connection more. But I find that YA authors don't like some of them are phenomenal, but some of them are just like written for children, and it's like okay. But then sometimes you read adult books and you're like, wow, this is just smart. But a lot of the popular ones on Book Talk are not. They actually have complex characters and like development and all that kind of stuff. The thing I go looking for when I read is stories where I feel seen and comforted. It's the stories where I can feel myself in the main character. Or feel myself in all the characters. Like in Throne of Glass, I connect to the male characters as much as I do with the women characters. And I think that's very important as well. Not to get really scientific here, but there is a neuroscience connection. Romance simulates empathy and attachment. It doesn't desensitize people from what they're reading. It lets readers feel seen and practice emotional safety. Again, these are just almost like trial grounds for the real world. You get to play out those emotions. So it is this emotional safety net in these worlds. Porn, on the other hand, creates a dopamine loop in the brain, triggering instant gratification. And the object of pornography doesn't allow for emotional intimacy to take hold. Pornography has been found to negatively affect men's body image, have more negative views, anxiety, and avoidance to real romantic relationships. It often features violent and degrading representations of women, who are completely voiceless typically, and the depictions often get worse for gender minorities and people of color. And again, more men watch pornography than women, but that is often because women are naturally overwhelmed by the woman hating theme that is so universal throughout pornography that it just doesn't seem appealing. And this may contribute to why women's fantasy is a more important outlet and a better outlet for women. But women want the emotional safety and the emotional connection, which I think we should all want in relationships, which is often why there's like this divergent, or men are not reading but they're watching porn, and women are reading but they're reading emotional fantasy. It's a bit of a weird gap. Women's fantasies are often more about safety than submission. It's more about showing love as care and commitment, not just like sex. Even in like some of the books that are really seen as like smut, there is so much care and connection in those stories, and it shows that love is in action. It's practiced. It's like it shows what it is like to love someone. When people scoff at women's fantasy or romance novels, often misunderstanding what those stories are actually about. It's not about submission, it's about safety. In Bell Hook's books, All About Love, she writes, combination of care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust. Those are the true things that build intimacy, not domination. And in the world where women are often told to shrink themselves, to be quiet, accommodating, or grateful, especially in romantic relationships, fantasy and romance novels become one of the few spaces where women can imagine being safe enough to be fully seen, to have their full desires. In so many of the books I've read, and they are amazing love stories, but they're also amazing. They're just such amazing women, complex women, which is what women are actually like. It shows what women are actually like. And they have all the emotions and all these feelings. And it shows them making mistakes. And it shows them not being this flawless person. It shows what people are actually like in almost every fantasy book I've read. And it's often that the woman is finding herself in these, again, these are sort of like coming of age adventure stories in our own way. And they are often finding themselves, and they're finding a partner and a person who can value that as well, who is not threatened by that, who they are able to build an actual relationship and partnership with. And they both have voices, they both have frustrations, they both have concerns, but they work through those things as well. And I think that's what makes it so much more appealing to women, because it shows what life is actually like, and it shows a partner who respects you. Like, if the main character ends up with someone who doesn't respect them, you know it's not the end of the book. Love is a practice and not just a feeling. And in that sense, women's fantasy doesn't just provide escapism, it's often a rehearsal for what it will be like to have that connection. When men dismiss these books and women's books as porn, they're really revealing how little they understand about love as an ethical practice. These stories don't glorify sex without connection. They reimagine connection as sacred. They ask, what would desire look like if we actually felt safe? And that's something our culture still doesn't know how to answer. Again, these books are fantasy. They're not reality. But it does make us wonder, what would the world look like if that was what we were looking for? So if romance novels are women's version of porn, and I say that extremely lightly, maybe porn is just men's version of poorly written fantasy. And if you're sitting there thinking, Priya, there's no such thing as boys' books and girls' books, like anyone can read anything, and I'm all for you there. The truth is that's not necessarily true. When I remember growing up, there was a women's literature section, but no such thing as a men's literature section. These books that talk about equitable relationships and connection and what love could look like, these are for women only. It's like, how is that helpful? That's not helpful. Because those books should be available to everyone. Anyone who wants a decent relationship should be able to understand what that looks like in a literary form. Again, this also creates like a weird prison where like men are not supposed, and I say it very lightly with quotations, supposed to read these books. They're not supposed to read women's authorship and fantasy. They're not supposed to read romance books. And it's like, that is such bullshit. It should be such bullshit, but it's not. Which is really depressing, because men should be able to read whatever women read, and they should not be judged for it. For wanting healthy emotional connection, they should not be judged for that. And so I understand that we've also created this prison with patriarchy and creating and telling men that they are not meant to be the emotional gender. We've made this prison where they don't feel like they are able to access these books. But that has to stop. Like, it has to stop. Because if women, all of us, are getting raised and growing up reading more than men, and we're reading books where we're seen as equals, and we're reading books with emotional connection, and men aren't, it's like a weird thing where men are almost stunted emotionally in their emotional development, and women are surpassing that. And that has happened for a very long time anyway. But especially with the lack of reading and the way women are reading more and more, which is a good thing that everyone's reading more in some ways. It just shows like there's a great imbalance in the way that we have done emotional connection between men and women. And that obviously is showing up in dating, and it's showing up in our relationships, and it's a whole thing. But this is the patriarchy in motion, like not letting men read these books. When a book is written by a man, it's called literature. When it's written by a woman, it's considered niche. It's considered only for women, which is so weird. So weird, guys. Men's books can be read by both genders. That's universally and socially accepted. Women's books are often considered fringe, disregarded, and only for women. They're not considered serious literature. They're not considered classics, which does my head in. But the question is, why shouldn't men be reading books about women the same way we grew up reading about them in Harry Potter and Percy Jackson? Last year, I read 2 books from purely male perspectives, and 8 from alternating male and female narratives. That's kind of a balance. And yes, the alternating perspectives were all written by women, but it also doesn't reduce the male protagonist to some voiceless love interest, which frequently happens in male fantasies. I cannot even think of a male fantasy that's written from a woman's perspective that isn't complete horseshit. And there's not even many male fantasies that are written from a woman's perspective. They're all written from men's perspective. They don't offer alternating points of view. The women are just like voiceless objects, voiceless characters who have no agency. They're, again, one of the characters, they're either perfect, the love interest that has no voice, or this evil witch who seduces men. And it's like, why can't we just break out of that? Like, and that's why, even though they are written by women's authors, the alternating perspectives books are still really important because it shows the emotional complexities of these male characters. It gives you a connection to them. It's like, oh, I understand why you're doing this thing. That sucks. You're going through this challenge. And it's so important to read books whether they're written by men or women, that alternate perspectives or have the opposing perspective. You know what I mean? And it's not about dividing literature by gender. It's about expanding empathy. Once again, this gendered gap does have an impact on relationships. Porn and romance shape expectations very differently. Porn teaches instant gratification, dominance, and objectification. Romance teaches patience, vulnerability, and communication. Completely different things, my guy, okay? I will not lie that there is like a section called dark romance that I don't think is healthy. And once again showcases how abuse and violence is a poor disguise for love. But the vast majority of readers and writers stay away from those types of books to focus on real romantic connections. I don't understand the appeal of dark romance even remotely. I just don't. I think it's disgusting in many ways. Some people do like it, but again, not for your girl. Between pornography and romance books, one literally rewires the brain for detachment, and the other trains you for emotional intimacy. It fosters empathy for all genders to read romance. In a sweet and emotionally bonding sort of way. Often when men joke, and men and women both do it, when people joke that women's fantasy books are porn, they miss that those books are often the healthiest representation of relationships that we have in pop culture. Even in TV shows and movies, it still doesn't show the same empathetic connections and the same emotional intimacy as it does in novels and books. And so women's books written by women are often the healthiest representations we see of relationships on screen, in books, anywhere in media, honestly. And that is also why romance initially, from the start of it as a genre, had such a huge drive and such a huge fan base. Women's fantasy isn't about sex. It's often about emotional depth and development. Romance gives us a safe space to imagine love that's consensual, equal, and kind. And that shouldn't be revolutionary, but it still is. It's not just women who need that. It's also men who could use emotional literacy too. Kind of recap what we talked about. Women's fantasy does not equal pornography. In male narratives, the books we read in primary school and as children are not necessarily considered neutral. If you don't read past that, they're not neutral. You've only read from a male perspective. And that, again, like stunts the emotional and critical thinking skills you might have. Reading from the female perspective often builds empathy and challenges the idea that love or fantasy must center men. Women's stories deserve the same respect as men's. And if women finding joy, safety, and desire through stories makes you uncomfortable, or makes you want to dismiss these books as just smut, maybe the problem isn't the books. Maybe it's our societal expectations and pressure we put on women and the things we don't want women to read. Why would you want a woman to read about emotional connection and intimacy when that's not what the other half of our gender, like men, are being wired to do? And they should be wired for emotional intimacy. They should be allowed to read these books. Fantasy has always been about escape. And maybe it's time we escape the double standard too. If you're looking to get into books written by women and different fantasies that focus on women protagonists, Throne of Glass, again, I will shout it from the rooftops. Best series ever, 100%. Fourth Wing is also really popular, and that also is a fantasy series. There is a romance in it as well. If you're looking for more romance and not fantasy, Elsie Silver's books is really good, and she's a Canadian, so shout out there. And all of her books are about like cowboys and small town kind of like stories based in Canada. And those are really good. That's a good book series for if you're looking for more romance. And yeah, there's so many amazing books being put out right now that you can just honestly hop on Book Talk and look and see what you might like. But the real thing I want everyone to do is read and read widely. Don't stop reading just because you leave school. Keep going. If you've left middle school, if you've left high school, if you've left university, do not stop reading. And often I think as we grow up, people are more inclined to read nonfiction books, but at the same time, fiction books are so important for empathy and critical thinking development. So don't just narrow yourself into one box. Read both, obviously, but definitely keep reading. Literacy is one of the most important skills a person can have, and in our digital age, we gotta lock in on it because it's becoming less and less predominant. I'll leave you with this. What was the last book that made you feel seen and connect emotionally? Thanks for tuning in. If you had an aha moment or just enjoyed hanging out with me, pass this episode along, drop a quick review, and let's keep chatting over on Instagram. Also, feel free to subscribe and give this video a big thumbs up. Sharing is caring and it helps this podcast grow. I'll see you in the next episode.